Hi there, welcome to week 2 of Level Design for Games. This week we're going to go into some of the basics of shape and space theory, building on the foundation for how we're going to eventually use solid forms to sculpt 3D space in the coming weeks for game levels. So we're going to get started talking about this week about space theory, about space. Not that one, that one. Space, a blank page. It's the scariest thing to writers and designers alike. Essentially a void. So essentially nothingness. So from an architectural standpoint, space comes in sort of two flavors. Space can be empty or it's full. There can be something occupying a given space, or that space could be completely vacant and empty. So when you have empty space like this, or at least that's what this was representing, it's what's known as void. So in void space, there's no resistance to change. There's nothing really getting in your way. Many gameplay events can happen, and there's nothing impeding your movement as the player. So we could say that sort of void is full of possibility. It's a possibility space. Void also allows for clarity, for certainty, because it doesn't really block our vision as we look through space, so it sort of promotes knowledge and understanding. We can be sure we understand what is out there because we see it all. There's nothing blocking it, and we see what's not there. If there's any solid objects like this blue ball right here, we can see them pretty plainly. So the other state of space is called mass, or solid. So mass, as you would imagine, is the complete opposite. Mass is existence. So when space is taken up by a mass, it is static, resistant to change. So where one object resides, other objects can't overlap. They bounce off, or they react. Mass blocks and resists movement through it, putting sort of constraints on possibility. It creates borders and boundaries, and it defines what's impossible. And assuming it's not transparent as well, mass also occludes, so it blocks vision. It reduces sort of our knowledge base of what is out there, and it blocks anything that might or sort of be behind it or inside of it. We don't know because it blocks our vision. So where void and mass sort of interact is actually where we come in, and that's where things get really interesting. So neither one of these things can really exist on their own. Sort of void is meaningless without mass, mass is meaningless without void. It's the contrast that makes the big difference, and essentially the contrast is what creates shape. So the contrast between mass and void, that's the shape. And a scene that is essentially one or the other is sort of without shape. It's meaningless. And so when at least there's some of each, we can recognize how one defines the shape of the other. Void defines the shape of the mass, or mass defines the shape of the void. And that brings us to our next major concept in space design: positive and negative space. So I'm pretty sure you've probably seen this image before, or something very much like it. So this is known as the Rubens vase, and it's famous for its essentially very, very easy to understand, hopefully, demonstration of what positive and negative space are. So essentially, positive space at its most basic is space that is perceived to have shape. So positive space has shape, it has identity, while negative space is space that lacks shape. It's what's left over after the shape objects are sort of placed and we have shape. The things that are not shaped, that's the negative space. So if you look at this image right here, if you focus on this as an image of a vase, if you're focusing on the vase, what that means is that the white part of the image, the vase, is the positive space. It's the defined shape that we recognize. And the black all around it is the void. It's the negative space. The negative space around the positive space is what gives us that shape. So if we shift our attention to the faces, however, the faces become figures. Faces become what the shape is that the objects are. And if that is the case, that way of perception means that essentially the black space right here is the positive space, and the negative is what's left over. It's the negative space. So much like the concepts of mass and void, positive and negative are opposites and don't really mean a whole lot without one another. They sort of give meaning to each other. One defines the other. Positive space has shape. Negative space is the boundaries of that shape. And but it's important as we go forward that these don't correlate directly with mass and void. Negative space is not always necessarily void. So let's get into that a little bit. So in a case like this, where we have a void with a mass in it, so the mass is essentially the object with the shape, so it's the positive space. It's encompassing the positive space. The void is the negative space here. So positive and negative. However, if this were sort of reversed and maybe we were modeling out some sort of like cavern or sewer or something like that, we would kind of end up in this opposite situation of mass being the, I guess, the dominant sort of element here, and void actually being the shape of the space. And in this case right here, the void would be the positive space. It's the space that has shape, and the mass could go out in infinite, but it doesn't really have any foreseeable sort of boundaries. And this starts to get a little bit more complicated when we start talking about multiple combinations of this sort of concept. So in a case like this, we've got mass surrounding void, and that's creating sort of boundaries that give definition to the inside space, gives shape to the inside space. So this void is a positive space. Out here we have some more void space, and this is the negative space. And from this perspective, if you're standing outside, you would be looking at what appeared to be a box, which is a solid mass, and that is positive shape. So we have this sort of dynamic of negative space and positive space. But things start to get very tricky if we start to make this a little bit more porous. So as you can see, we start to take some of these away, and now we're looking at kind of this something in the middle, like what is the positive space and what is the negative space. And the truth is that this is the sort of most common sort of scenario we're going to experience in the world. Positive space and negative space also is sort of a matter of perspective as well. So imagine you are standing in a very small room, and the walls are very close in. It's obvious this feels like a positive space. It's very clear what the shape of the room is. But on the other hand, imagine if maybe you shrunk down to like the size of an insect or something like that. So we're going to zoom in really, really close. And from this perspective, the boundaries have sort of disappeared. They've gone off into the distance, and we find ourselves in the same space. But from this perspective, this feels very much like negative space.